Hi everyone, and thank you very much for joining us. We will have a few more people join us as we progress, but just to advise you before we commence that we are recording this session. So we know there are a few people who are not able to make it with us right now and are keen to hear what today's session will hold. So just to make sure you're aware of that. I'll start today by acknowledging that I'm coming to you from the lands of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nations, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge, let me check if he's in the room, but we do have a couple of elected members in here today. So Councillor Kim Ross, I can see from the City of Casey, and I think Councillor Stefan Kroomen, Mayor of the City of Casey, will be joining us as well. Also really pleased to have colleagues from, I think at last count around 15 or 16 growth area councils across Australia, and we're really pleased that we can facilitate this discussion for you today. Really delighted to have Scott Langford join us, the CEO of Housing Australia. Welcome, Scott. We have seen you all over Senate estimates in the last few weeks and really felt for you during that process, and we feel really privileged that that you're here today to talk to us. And thanks to Elizabeth Kelleher-Cook and Michelle from our team for making this happen today. How we'll work today is, in a minute, I'll hand over to Scott. He'll give us a presentation today. Obviously, we're focusing on the Housing Australia Future Fund, or HAF. There is a Q&A section you'll see at the top of your screens there. Please put any of your questions in there. There will be time at the end for a facilitated discussion, and thanks to those of you who've already sent questions in. So we have registered them. And yeah, basically, we're thrilled to have you here. Growth areas, as you know, are a really important part of Australia's response to our housing challenges. Growth areas, councils make up just 5% of all local government areas in Australia, but will deliver 26% of the Housing Accord targets. And I can say for certainty that all of the NGAA members on this call today have all had really some successful outcomes in the delivery and partnerships around social and affordable housing as well. So we're really keen for this conversation. So without further ado, I will hand over to you, Scott, and we'll come back after your presentation for some Q&A.
Thank you. Now, can you hear me? I seem to just be having some technical difficulties here.
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Okay. Well, look, thank you so much for bringing this together today. I am just trying to bring up the presentations, which I seem to be having a technical difficulty with, having tried that a few moments ago. So, Elizabeth, I might see if you can join the slides, because my computer seems to have completely frozen, as the best of technology in 2026 does. But as we begin today, can I acknowledge that I'm presenting this today from Sydney. I'm on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, but I extend acknowledgement and respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people right around the country, to elders past, present and emerging, and to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander colleagues that may be joining us on the call today. Now, I am very sorry, but my screen has gone completely blank, and so I'm hoping you can still hear me, and Elizabeth, you can see that the slides are coming up.
Yes, we can hear you, and the slides are on, I believe.
Okay, well, I will talk to a blank screen, and I'm glad you can all hear and see that it's working, and apologies that I'm having some technical difficulties on my side. But Bronwyn and the team at the National Growth Areas Alliance, can I just say thank you very much for bringing this together today. As you outline, the housing challenge is significant right across the country and right across the housing continuum, and the contribution of growth areas to addressing the supply challenges and creating really great places for a whole cross-section of the community to live is so important. I am going to talk to you today about the HAF round 3. But as I do that, before I go any further, I just need to emphasise that because I'm talking about a program that is an active procurement, if there are any specific questions, I'd direct you to the call for submissions document, which sets out the program in full, and any addenda that we might issue through the Housing Australia portal. So perhaps as a little bit of context setting, many of you may have heard of Housing Australia or elements of the work we do, but before we get to talk specifically about HAF Round 3, I wanted to take the opportunity to talk a little bit more about what it is that Housing Australia does. So we're the Australian Government's National Housing Agency. What we're charged with doing is deploying capital and guarantees to help catalyse projects right along the housing continuum. We do that all the way from crisis accommodation right through to social and affordable housing, which will be the focus of our discussion today, and also a range of programs and products that we have that support people to access home ownership. Our role is as an enabler, so we work with the private sector, community housing providers, local government, state government, and our overarching objective is how do we use the tools that we've got to help to make projects viable, to help people access home ownership, ultimately about improving housing outcomes for Australians. We really focus our efforts around two major streams of work. The first of those is what we call More Homes. So it is a part of our business that very much does what it says on the tin. We're focused on how we use funding and financing to support the delivery of more homes, particularly at crisis, transitional, social and affordable housing end of the housing continuum. We have some funding that also supports broader enabling infrastructure that moves into market product as well. Inclusive of a range of debt products that we're able to offer to community housing providers, the government's equipped us with an ability to borrow money from the markets and to make other financial commitments up to a total of about $42 billion. So it's a fairly substantial commitment that the Commonwealth is making, deployed through Housing Australia to help support more homes. We then have a part of our business that's focused on more homeowners, recognising that the great Australian dream and that step into ownership continues to be an important part of the housing continuum, but one that many Australian households have increasingly struggled to take that step. So there are two primary tools that we have in the More Homeowners part of our organisation. The first is the Australian Government's 5% deposit scheme, which aims to support people to own their home sooner, and the Help to Buy program, which provides a shared equity co-contribution that will help up to 40,000 households over the next 5 years. Combined, we see that the home ownership programs in Housing Australia will be supporting about 80,000 households a year in Australia to take that step into ownership. Now, we share with the NGAA some really important commitments around the desire to improve housing outcomes in the context of really great places. And we know that fast-growing outer metropolitan communities are really important, and that within the context of that, the creation and the inclusion of a diversity of housing outcomes is really important. We recognise the unique pressures that are facing growth areas, and we understand that things like rapid population growth can have put pressures on infrastructure and other sort of services delivery, that transport connectivity and local job availability and access is really important factors and can have impacts on communities as you're growing. We know that land supply zoning and development sequencing can be challenges, but also opportunities for how those things are considered and built in over time. And we know that there's a very significant demand that in expanding communities, the opportunity to ensure that there's diversity of housing right along the housing continuum right from the outset is thought about and considered in the way that those elements of integration of planning and infrastructure and delivery happens. So we do know that that also creates certain pressures on communities, and it's certainly somewhere that more natural levels of affordability, but also opportunity, will drive a greater number of households might be looking for more appropriate housing. And we do know that there is a need to ensure that there are mechanisms, some of which we can provide, that help to support the inclusion of social and affordable housing as part of the mix. So if we turn to talk a little bit about the Housing Australia Future Fund, it's an ambitious program that the Commonwealth developed that set a target of supporting 40,000 new social and affordable homes over a 5-year delivery window that started on the 1st of July 2024 and runs through until the 30th of June 2029. The aim is that we use the funding tools available to us to help increase the supply of social and affordable housing, and then we'll continue to provide support to that, for that to be well maintained and well operated for at least 25 years post-completion. We really understand that in order to achieve that target, it's about how we work with state government, local government, and the private sector and community housing providers to bring together really important elements and create a long-lasting legacy that will hopefully be a catalyst to outcomes well beyond the HAF program itself. It's been designed to have the broadest possible impact over a sustained period, and it is about increasing supply, but it's also about providing long-term funding certainty to the community housing sector and others that are working in that space, and catalysing development that will last well into the long term, and in overcoming some of the current hurdles that might exist in the feasibility of delivering social and affordable housing. We've got a combination of loan and grant products that we use to support the objectives of the HAF, and those are set out in our investment mandate. And we're also looking to ensure that there's a diversity of locations and a diversity of vulnerable cohort in social housing waitlists around the country. Children and youth, veterans, people with disability, and First Nations people. We've run 2 rounds of the HAF already, and we were contracted funding to support 18,650 homes. We've provided that funding to eligible funding recipients like community housing providers, who have then in turn been able to contract with the development industry at various points in the cycle and at various stages in the development program to support delivery of new homes. And in the context of Australia, we know that one of the challenges at the moment is the time it can take for projects to move through planning. And then if we think about, for example, apartments, on average, the dwelling completion time, according to the ABS, is about 2.4 years. For detached housing, it's about just coming up on about 9 to 12 months, depending on location. So what we see with the HAF out of rounds 1 and 2 is the program is now starting to ramp up. As at the end of January, we were about 19 months into that 5-year delivery window, and 895 homes complete, more than 9,500 in development, another 8,000 in planning. And with the launch of procurement for round 3, we're looking to commit funding to a further 21,350. We also know that some of the projects we've already committed funding to are not only delivering social and affordable housing, but they're part of larger projects that are delivering market product for people to purchase, which will either become rental stock or it'll become homes that people move into as homeowners. And so we've seen that this integrated delivery model is creating a diversity of housing outcomes, and the HAF contribution can be catalytic to larger projects, which is really important. As an example of the sort of projects, we've got a wide diversity of the size and nature of projects that we funded. But in terms of one that we funded in HAF round 1, I'll talk a little bit about a project called Boronia, which is by City West Housing in the city of Sydney. And talk about that from a couple of perspectives. One is that there were contributions from the local government that have enabled City West to secure the land and bring some of the planning together. In the end, the funding from the HAF has allowed them to develop 74 affordable homes, and it's got contributions also from the state government that have layered into the way that they've been able to deliver it. It's in an area where there's a lot of urban regeneration, so perhaps a little bit different to some of the growth area contexts, but in a context here where the provision of an inclusive community requires affordable housing, in this case a mix of 1, 2 and 3 bedroom apartments in a really well located area that's got access to transport and other amenity. We know that, in fact, the impact is very real because we've had the opportunity to hear the story of one of the first residents that moved into this building when it completed, a lady called Carrie Ann, who's spoken publicly about the significant impact that it's had for her to have access to affordable housing. And she has talked publicly about how she experienced job loss from what she thought was a very dependable and well-paid job, and then had a series of other significant life challenges that followed, including that she was in the private rental market. She experienced significant rent increases that put real pressure on her in terms of the ability to stay connected to community, to friends and family and others, and that she found herself in a life position she never contemplated being in, where she was on the brink of homelessness. She was able to secure an affordable unit in Boronia. Her rent is capped, and it's allowed her to have a sense of safety and security in a nice, high amenity new building in a great location. But it's probably a great example of the powerful impact of good affordable housing and how it allows people to stay connected to the story of community, connected to opportunities for employment. And it is along the housing continuum. I mean, one of the reasons we're really focused on HAF providing 20,000 social and 20,000 affordable homes, recognising that communities need access to both to really flourish. So in terms of how we've thought about HAF and the delivery going forward, well, in rounds 1 and 2, we've had a different approach, but we had a lot of feedback from the market, and we learned a lot from the feedback we received about how people want to work with us, what's the best way for us to deploy commitments and give increasing levels of certainty over time. So we thought a lot about that. We took that feedback and we worked together with colleagues in Commonwealth Treasury. We reflected on the insights and feedback we had from market, and we designed round 3 to adopt what's called a non-competitive open 2-stage process. What that means in practice is that as we've gone to the market with the call for submissions, we are assessing applications on the merit of the individual application rather than on a comparative basis. It allows us to assess projects as they're put to us. It allows us to think about how it fits with the overall objectives and criteria we've set for round 3. And it allows us to go through 2 stage gates, the expression of interest, which we've asked for information, which is largely about the project and the partners, and then move through with an invitation to application, which really says to the applicant, you can now progress with a greater level of certainty, not a defined outcome, but the ability to now do the further work and make a detailed application, which allows you to then submit for a funding decision. There are 4 distinct streams that we designed into round 3 as one of the mechanisms that we've used to try and achieve a range of different policy objectives. And something I would make really clear is that HAF at 40,000 homes and quite a big headline dollar figure, we know it's only a small part of the overall demand for housing and certainly for social and affordable housing. So there are inevitably going to be some really meritorious and great projects that we won't be able to commit to. But what we did in round 3 was create different streams to give us the best shot of getting a distribution of different outcomes, noting that then there are other programs, other state government programs and potentially other Commonwealth programs that can provide support because there will be a need for things beyond the round 3 of HAF. The first stream I'll talk about is the First Nations stream. So one of the things that we're very clear about is wanting to encourage First Nations organisations to come forward to build their balance sheets and their autonomy and their ability to provide housing relative and relevant to their local communities. The second stream was about housing diversity, which had a goal about a broader geographic distribution. It allowed us to think about how partnerships might come together to encourage community housing providers in particular to work with partners like local government and other actors in the system to bring together proposals at different scales that would be relevant to deliver.
Oh, hello.
Sorry?
Oh, yeah.
Hello? Sorry?
Strange, sorry.
That's right.
Not sure who that was.
No worries. Stream 3 is one that's a targeted offering directly to states and territories. So we have a great partnership with states and territories. We've recognised their primary role as stewards of particularly the social housing system, but as a really important driver of housing outcomes. And so we have made an offer to work in partnership with states where they can allocate a package of funding across projects they see as priority, and we will help deliver those with funding support we can provide. And then Stream 4, which is partnerships at scale. It's about delivering large-scale packages what we're hoping is a greater speed to outcome, and also looking at how we mobilise and attract institutional investment to support some much larger scale packages with a minimum portfolio size of 500 dwellings in a package. So across those 4 streams, there's a diversity of typologies and applicant sites that we think will ultimately be funded. But what we want to do is ultimately ensure that everything is geared towards maximising public investment and making the biggest difference for the long term. What that means in terms of some of the specific objectives we've then set, so I've talked about the First Nations stream, but we want to make meaningful progress towards some of the closing the gap targets. We know that that means increasing the number of homes that are owned and led by First Nations organisations, and so there is a $600 million ring-fenced commitment of availability payments, which is an annual payment made over the course of 25 years, so a total nominal pool of $600 million dedicated to First Nations-led organisations. And across all of the streams, we've set a requirement that 10% of all the social housing must have an allocation to First Nations households. We want to really ensure that the housing that's delivered is culturally appropriate, well supported, and will exist within a strong ecosystem that's strengthening outcomes right across the community. Delivery certainty, or what we've called keys indoors, is really important. We know that in the midst of what has often been termed in the media a housing crisis, there has to be a sense of urgency to action. And while there are some really fantastic long-run projects that we know people are working on that will involve, potentially, say, rezonings and significant upfront infrastructure that will be delivered over the course of years, at the moment the priority is us to provide funding where we can see a certain pathway to get a housing outcome with an Australian household living in it as soon as possible, and certainly no later than 30th of June 2029. We're aiming for a geographic distribution, so there are, across the whole 40,000, there are minimum targets for minimum 1,200 homes in each state and territory, which for some states and territories is below population share if you distributed the outcomes otherwise. And we also want to encourage a diversity across metropolitan and regional areas. That also includes, within metropolitan areas, the nature and the location of product and where it's located. We really do know that there is demand everywhere for more social and affordable housing, not just in major cities, but we want to ensure that there are opportunities across the round and in the way that we allocate the funding. We've varied application sizes so that there are minimum thresholds, and in largest capital cities, there's a minimum threshold, for example, in the housing diversity stream of 200 dwellings in a package. But in other locations, it's up sort of 50 dwellings, and in First Nations, we're offering to work with First Nations providers on projects as small as, say, 5 houses. The location really does matter, and we want to ensure that the homes are well located and have connection to amenity and to all the infrastructure that you need in order to make these good places for everyone to live. We recognise, particularly in growth areas, that sequencing may be something we need to give consideration to. So as long as we can see the potential and that the actual a likelihood that other amenity and infrastructure will be delivered, then it is a project that we're likely to be able to support. What we're trying to encourage is that thoughtful, well located, with the right ingredients around it to make it great housing outcomes in a great place. What we're trying to avoid is where this becomes housing that might be marooned in an environment that doesn't have access to local community infrastructure that you'd normally expect, or it won't have for an extended period of time into the future, 5, 7, 10 years, because that may not be best use of the limited funding we've got at this point in time. And finally, we're really interested in enduring community value. So what that means for us is a really good value, upfront value for money offer, but also that there is value accreting within either a community housing provider, a First Nations housing provider, or another eligible funding recipient. That means that there is a long-term community resource that is being built that will continue to provide housing and related services and supports beyond the 25-year life of the HAF funding program. So we want to make sure that that's baked into the models we receive, and we think that the key to doing that is really impactful partnerships. So for us, we think that and observe that over the first 2 rounds and across our broader activities, the most impactful proposals we receive tend to have multiple partners who've each made a contribution, whether that is land, whether that's capital, whether it's a set of capabilities that allows for a bigger impact than if any one applicant came forward solely on their own. We really do think that that helps to manage risk, but also to create the best bang for buck and really good long-term enduring outcomes. So if there is any key message you take from today, it's that we think collaboration is the key, and clearly this forum is an indication that it's a group of people that understand the importance of collaboration, sharing insights, but also working together to get a bigger outcome. Now, since we opened round 3 on the 30th of January, we've already seen a really strong response from the market, and that's been fantastic. And in fact, in a couple of the streams, particularly partnerships at scale and housing diversity, we've received enough expressions of interest to date that if all of those ultimately went through to a funding approval, we would have exhausted the funding that's available to us. We think it's a really fantastic indication of the willingness of lots of different partners to respond, and people heard the messages we gave last year, understood the briefing we gave on the 10th of December, did some work perhaps over summer, and on the 30th of January responded quickly. We're committed to assessing those expressions of interest in the order they're being received. And I want to make it really clear that just because expressions of interest being received doesn't mean that they'll be approved, or that even if they're invited to application, it doesn't necessarily mean that that application will be approved. There's still a whole set of rigorous criteria. And in that detailed application, one that we haven't had visibility to through the expression of interest will be the value for money through the financial offer that's submitted. We do expect that there'll also be some expressions of interest that will drop away, that people's circumstances might change, or there might be other factors that weigh against an applicant's ability to progress. And that's quite a normal part of these sort of processes. So we talk about it being on demand, but obviously there's a lot of demand initially. What we've been saying to multiple groups is the expressions of interest at this stage remain open. And if you and or partners are thinking about making a submission, we encourage you to do that. Of course, we encourage you to be mindful about the quantum of resources you need to make that application, bearing in mind that at the moment there has been a high level of interest in the program. We're going to evaluate every application fairly, consistently on its merits, and the goal is that every applicant has a fair opportunity. That does include if we get to a point where we have a reasonable view that available funding will be exhausted, that we will tell people that, so that there's real transparency and you can make informed assessments about whether you continue to use resources to pursue funding from us, or perhaps there are other opportunities that you might pursue outside of the HAF round 3. So success for us means really well located, high quality homes that are going to meet community needs, that are going to remain affordable over the long term, that are well supported and well integrated into the range of issues and challenges that I'm sure you're dealing with every day, how it fits with the community development, the economic development story, the infrastructure story, the planning overlay, and goes to ultimately what I think all of us who work in housing or have touched it in our professional lives aspire to be part of, the creation of really great places that work for a diverse range of people in our community. At Housing Australia, we really do see collaboration as the pathway, and we're really focused on ways that we can support partners, including being really transparent about what we can do and any challenges that we might have, but also being clear where we are able to make really important commitments to these great projects. We know that the NGAA represents some of the fastest growing communities in Australia, and that you've got really great, unique on-the-ground knowledge that's so important. And we think that there are multiple roles that means that you'll end up playing, and whether it's through HAF or other programs that we support, or hopefully through the broader picture of housing diversity and right along the housing continuum, your insights into how infrastructure gaps or opportunities might affect the viability of housing projects, your insights into how the priority of where things are developed and when, and really the changing needs of communities over time and how that reflects. And one thing I would say is that I think inclusion from the outset of a diversity of housing typologies and outcomes is so important to future-proof strategic planning in the long run. we really recognise and welcome the significant impact that this group's having, and realise the very historic opportunity that is currently in place with HAF Round 3. It's the largest round of HAF, and we think one of the largest investments the Commonwealth has made into social and affordable housing, certainly for a period of decades. And we know that one of the things driving us too is that there is a moment in every project where it completes and someone has the key put in their hand, and for the first time they put the key in the door and they walk in and they're home and they feel safe, and that's now their place. And ultimately, there is no better feeling than knowing that you've contributed to that and that that is an enduring outcome that will be in your community. So we really appreciate the work that each of you do. We look forward to continuing to work in partnership, and I'll be really pleased to move to a discussion and see if there are any questions I can answer. If there's something very specific around HAF 3, I'll probably need to direct you to submit it through the Housing Australia portal so that we can ensure that we maintain the probity of that process. But really happy to talk about general terms of HAF Round 3 and, in fact, the other programs that we run, and hear your feedback too about how we support you and your communities to continue to deliver great places. So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you today.
Thanks, Scott. That was fantastic. Really great overview of some really important work that is happening for our nation, and we're really pleased to think that we're part of the solution. There are some questions coming in the Q&A, but I might kick off with and bring in one from the Q&A just on some bigger picture issues around. We talked about the term well located, and one of the things that we're trying to convey through government to government is growth areas can be well located too.
Absolutely.
And if I look over at Perth at the moment, with the Metronet stations, and there is fantastic new train stations throughout the outer suburbs, and really well located. And so our concern from a big picture issue is this tendency to think that urban renewal can only happen in 150-year-old suburbs versus some of our members who may have historic town centres that were country towns and are now suburban centres, or they might have been developed 30, 40, 50 years ago and are ripe for renewal. And so just love your take on that concept of well located, and does it sort of equal in, I think in some politicians' minds, that equals inner city or, those inner ring suburbs?
It's a great question. So let me firstly say I won't guess at what's in politicians' mind. I've only worked for government for 18 months, and I've learned that that's not a good idea. Look, I think you're right. It can sometimes become in the public discourse a coda for well located means within existing communities with what most people would consider that all the right ingredients for amenity and infrastructure. Where, as I was talking through round 3, we do understand that it may need to be have a time horizon to it, to say it hasn't got the ingredients to be well located if these other pieces are in train and happening around it. And I think you're right. It's not just about inner city locations. Sitting here in Sydney, and I declare I'm an Adelaide boy originally, so I think I have a bias that says that away from the inner Sydney, I've also got a minister that's based in Melbourne who reminds me that Sydney is not the capital of anything. I jest, but there are some really great. On the fringes of Sydney, and if you think about stand in Parramatta and look west, that is where the growth of Sydney is largely going to happen, as an example, and it's got a lot of the attributes that will allow the development of great infrastructure over time. Our challenge is to think about, well, if the housing we're supporting is being delivered in, let's say, the next 2 years, what's around that housing that makes it a good place to live now as those other elements are developed over time? And so there's a bit of a sequencing consideration, and we want to make sure that wherever we're supporting housing, it's good for today, but maybe it becomes a great place over the next 5 years as other committed projects infrastructure renewal takes place. So it's something we're alert to. I'm sure we won't get it perfectly right, but very open to the concept that well located doesn't have to mean within 5 k's of the GPO of a major capital city.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Good to hear. And I suppose following on from that, another question in the Q&A section is around other national strategic priorities. We had a question from some of our Perth members around workforce surges linked to AUKUS, for example, defence and other manufacturing projects, and just some feedback on if round 3 of the HAF, because, you know, this is all, and I really liked your point earlier about connection and community. And so in an area that's going to experience a massive surge in population and productivity, there is an existing local community that's already is in need of housing support. So in that and a broader context, will round 3 take into consideration those big national strategic priorities that are happening?
We've given some consideration to that in the design of round 3. So colleagues in Commonwealth Treasury who support the work of the National Housing Supply and Affordability Council, there's obviously an overlay of mapping of the sort of broader demand equation, and within that context, you know, there would be an overlay where, you know, as the example given, I think, you know, AUKUS is going to be a driver of housing demand in particular locations. The challenge that we then have is how do we translate a very, you know, relevant but significant range of different priorities across the whole of the country down to a project prescription where we can actually put funding and have that responded to by the market. So we've tried through the stream design and some of the criteria to provide some filters that allow us to kind of look at the distribution of outcomes. I don't think we'll get it all right. And in part, it's because if you put the 40,000 in context of, you know, let's say the Accord ambition, which is, you know, a commitment of 3 levels of government and industry to say how Australia should push towards 1.2 million homes over that 5-year Accord period. You know, the 40,000 is important, but it's a smaller part. So it's a longer way of saying if projects come forward from those areas, I think we will absolutely respond to them, but we haven't been able to prescribe down to a level that would say, well, in those locations, we must fund those as sort of first priority because unfortunately, such is the demand for social and affordable housing around the country. In most markets, we can make a cogent argument for why housing needs should be met.
And just quickly, a definition of affordable.
Yeah, I sort of joked that
quickly. I should have put that in air quotes.
Look, it is a really important question, and I joke that Australia is a federation divided by state borders and territories, and each with their own definition for all of these things. So firstly, to say there is no national definition at the moment. Again, colleagues in Commonwealth Treasury continue to look at this question. We, for the purposes of HAF, have set a definition that it must be 74.9% of market or lower, and that applicant must have regard to the household income for an eligible household. So there are income limits depending on the household composition, so adults and number of kids. And then we say you should have regard to what approximately 30% of income would be for those rental costs in that market. What that guides us to is in many locations, it can be up to 75%, 74.9% of the market rent. But in higher value rental locations, we'd expect the applicant to offer a further reduction so that they're not putting eligible households into housing stress. So again, it's one of those things that I'd say is imperfect, but it is a recognition that there is a need to have a stepped approach so people can move into the market, in and out of the market as may be appropriate as well.
Yeah. Good answer. There's another question here just around local government capacity or some of the restrictions local government can face when putting an EOI in for HAF. And I remember over the last few years having similar conversations about the National Housing Infrastructure Facility and other programs administered by Housing Australia. And that is around short lead times for delivery. It's about, there's a question here about requirements about portfolio minimums. And I remember there were also sort of barriers or challenges around special purpose vehicles and, debt ceilings and all these sorts of things. And has there been an evolution of thinking in your time around capacity for local government and how could get local government more involved than just gifting land? And what are some other options you see for local government to get more involved?
I think there's a spectrum of opportunity that ranges from strong policy intent and obviously the planning controls that local authorities have, through to much more involved project structures. There are so within the Housing Australia's investment mandate, local government is identified as an eligible applicant for a range of the programs. People may be aware, but there is a constitutional peculiarity in that we can't contract directly with a local government, which I certainly spent some time with government lawyers understanding that even though they're named in the investment mandate, we can't actually directly fund. And that is where the special purpose vehicle kind of construct comes up as a potential option for a structure. But I recognise that has complexities for governance and other arrangements that local governments have to factor in. Where we've probably started to see the real traction coming through is in partnerships where local governments have got existing relationships with, let's say, community housing providers who are eligible applicants, and they can work together either on a site or strategic pipeline of sites, and the CHP can seek funding into a vehicle it might support. And there are arrangements that ultimately might look like joint ventures, or there are some models emerging of ground lease where local councils are making land available on, say, a 49-year ground lease, with the community housing provider then accessing funding to build the bricks and mortar, but the sort of community ownership and stewardship being retained in the long term. So there are different options, but I recognise there's some complexities to those. And I also acknowledge that the way that we've run round 3 of HAF in particular, because of the very strong early demand and knowing that local governments often have to go through a stepped governance process, it may mean that applications have come in or expressions of interest have come in sort of after the initial wave that was received by Housing Australia. It's something we can give thought to in the medium term, but obviously for round 3, we're in the midst of an active procurement. But if there are great projects and partners that are there, if HAF can't allocate funding to those, we would hope that there are other mechanisms like state government programs and the like. But it's that probably step towards collaborative arrangements that we think is a really important part of the mix.
Yeah, great. And I think that's what we see across the country are some fantastic partnerships with community housing providers and others, community service providers as well, because at the end of the day, it's about the people who will live in a house, and, it's not just the house itself. So a couple of other quick questions. Timing of round 3 announcements, and then I would add in round 4. If we're getting ready for that. And within that, I know, perhaps you could talk about round 2, because I know you can't talk about round 3 content, but are there sort of more interesting proposals as well for prefab or modular housing? I know that was one of the priorities in amongst the Housing Accord discussions. So any feedback on that?
Yeah, great. So firstly, timing and announcements. So in the call for submissions, we set out that the first expressions of interest, we would be able to issue an invitation to application for successful EOIs from about mid-March. And in fact, last week we sent a note out to all the applicants that have to date that said between the 16th and the 30th of March, the first of what we call Tranche A, which is applicants that we've assessed in that first batch, will be receiving an invitation to proceed to an application. And then from the 30th of March onwards, we'll move into that sort of Tranche B, which is that sort of second wave of expressions of interest. There will come a point, probably in the course of April, where we will have approved enough expressions of interest that we can reasonably form a view, even if some of those applications are unsuccessful, that all the funding would end up being exhausted. And we're going to be really transparent and tell people at that point that we don't think it's fair to continue to invite people to move through the process at that point, on the basis that the likelihood of success is being able to be funded is so low. And so we will give people the insight and information. So really key message between, from 16th of March onwards, that second stage of invitation to application will start. People then have 8 weeks to make an application. Once the application comes in, it takes, we've committed to between 8 to 12 weeks, depending on whether they're asking for senior debt from us, for mortgage funds effectively. If they are, it's up to sort of 12 weeks until we're able to either give them an approval or a funding decision, depending on what they've asked for. So that's sort of the process and timeline. HAF4, that is a question for government. At the moment, our focus is really on delivery of the funding support to 40,000 homes, which is the major policy objective. What we would observe is that where around the world programs have got traction and brought great partnerships together, it starts to demonstrate to government, but actually really importantly to communities, that there is a mechanism that can create meaningful change. And I think that is one of the things that's going to be so important, is also to take the community on this journey, that here are outcomes that really matter and are making a difference in places around Australia. And that builds support for future governments to make decisions about things that will continue to support more social and affordable housing. And then modern methods of construction, really important part of the equation. I think that in many ways there's broad recognition that we're still building in much the same way we were sort of 50 years ago. There's been a sort of an evolution, not a revolution. Modern methods of construction is really important to getting efficiencies into the construction system. It is not the panacea. It's not going to solve all the problems, but we understand it's a part of the mix. We actually have funded a couple of projects that have incorporated modern methods of construction, either sort of modular components, or in one instance, we're funding a project that will be completely built off-site and then delivered and sort of installed on-site. So it's a smaller part of what we've done today. And for everyone who's been involved in looking at projects with modern methods of construction, and particularly modular, there are still some challenges in Australia to overcome. The tyranny of distance is one, and the sort of strength of supply chains. But we are looking at ways we can support that within the construct of also needing to make sure we deliver high quality and reasonably quickly. So that's the opportunity now, but it is something we see as being a bigger part of the delivery mix in years ahead.
Yeah, it's an interesting situation, isn't it, when we have such large targets and, trying to transition to modern methods as well as at the same time, it's just a lot happening all at once. And that sort of takes me to another question, which is around the Help to Buy scheme, if you don't mind, if we move on that one a bit, because all of our data shows that first home buyers are still very keen on a detached dwelling in a greenfield area.
Yeah.
Hence, we are still, our members' development approvals and completions are very high. There are definitely areas that are restricted through enabling infrastructure lack, where it feels like state authorities who deliver that infrastructure were caught off guard by a national housing target. But I just wondered if, some of those thoughts on how you're seeing Help to Buy roll out. It's very popular. and there's a question here around, you know, the intricacies of when the interest is paid to the government, whether during the course of the loan or after at sale. And I suppose just to, you know, to tie all that up to say, you know, could you sort of be a bit of our champion as well to say, you know, growth areas is still where it's happening, and schemes such as Help to Buy really do push growth in outer suburban areas, and we welcome it. And, you know, that's what our members are there for, and they're prepared and they do a great job of supporting those communities. And I suppose just to keep that at top of mind. Yeah.
Yeah, look, it's a really important point, and I agree. I think if you bring to mind the great Australian dream, most people almost instinctively will picture the, you know, quarter acre block or the little bit of grass in the backyard with a tree, and, you know, that does tend to fall to certain geographic locations. There's also that natural drive because of the relative affordability and, you know, people's aspiration for what that means to sort of have dirt underneath the feet.
Yeah.
So, you know, certainly recognise that. For the brief kind of overview, so Help to Buy is a program where we're able to contribute 30% of the cost of an existing home or 40% of the cost of a new home. So there's an inbuilt incentive for people who are looking for new build, just in terms of the quantum of funding we can provide. There are property price caps and income eligibility that apply, and they're different right around the country. But within that construct, people can apply. They go through one of the currently 2 lenders we're working with. We're about to expand the panel of lenders that people can go to get their traditional mortgage. Really what Help to Buy is doing is reducing the amount you need to borrow from the bank, which means that if you have a challenge servicing a higher amount of borrowing from the bank, you can borrow less effectively. So on a new home, you only need to borrow 60% minus your deposit amount. We make that contribution up front now, and we do fund construction of new homes with sort of progressive drawdown through the process. And then in answer to the question about there is no interest per se, what we are doing is that we have a proportional share, and that can be adjusted over time. People can buy out the government's share. So if people's income it goes up and they want to buy out the government's share, they can do that at that point in time. But it's proportional. So if the house is worth $500,000 today, and in 5 years' time it's experienced a lot of growth and it's now worth $1 million, the government's share moves proportionally, but it moves up and down. So if markets go up, government share proportionally moves. If markets go down, so it goes down. People can repay at certain points, or if they want to, they need to repay in certain conditions. So if they, for example, want to turn it into a rental property, that's not the purpose of the scheme. They'd need to repay it. But otherwise, that can sit there. And my favourite story to date of someone who's been approved and gone and bought their home through Help to Buy is a 78-year-old gentleman who'd never owned a home in his life. He had a little bit of savings and some a defined benefit scheme, and was able to borrow a modest amount from his bank. With Help to Buy, has been able to purchase that home, and in reality will probably repay that as part of an estate in 10 or 15 years' time, or hopefully longer for his sake. But what it's doing is really unlocking that step into ownership for other people. But yes, there is a proportional share that's then repaid at various points in time, or if you sell the property.
It's a lovely story, isn't it?
Yeah, I thought that was great. 78 years old, and he said, "I'm finally a homeowner," and I thought, how good's that?
Oh, that's great. That's great. Just check if there are any other questions that people would like to put into the Q&A before we wrap up. I think we've sort of covered everything that is there. We've talked about the complexities of directly funding local government, and that's why constitutionally that cannot be done. We've heard about round 3 outcomes. We've looked at national strategic priorities and challenges faced by local government, looked at affordability, modern methods, and help to buy. So I think we've covered off everyone's questions. So just to wrap up, I suppose, what's next? I mean, it's not just the HAF. You've got so much going on. Where do you see, how could we continue to be useful in terms of equipping our member councils with knowledge and information, and how can we keep cooperating with you to put our issues on an agenda when at some point?
Yeah, well, look, thank you. I mean, firstly, thanks for the opportunity today. And I think opportunities like this are really important, something I'm happy to continue to do. And the broader Housing Australia team can also get involved. We love to hear, your insights and feedback. And I think it's that real connection to the on-the-ground issues. Local governments in particular are the closest in many cases to the real outcomes in community, and that it is the day-to-day issues of community life that then go to informing how, in our case, program and delivery design, but, can then be fed into broader policy considerations. So important. I think there will be ongoing opportunities. I mean, our vision is that, things like HAF are catalytic to partnerships, to different approaches that encourage people to try things and to work in new ways, because we recognise that there are all these multiple pressures on the system. And, as we talked about at the outset, particularly those elements in growth areas of the sequencing of infrastructure and community development and economic development and, the provision of housing, it's all interwoven. So, you've got the insights and knowledge, and in many ways we're the grateful recipients of that to help inform ways we can ultimately then equip you and other partners to deliver great outcomes. So I look forward to continuing the conversation, and thank you to everyone that's made time for this today.
Great. Thank you very much, Scott. And thank you again to Elizabeth for helping us organise this, and Michelle for arranging for our members to be part of it. We really appreciate it. Why don't we wrap up and give everyone a spare 3 minutes back into their day?
You generous soul, you. There you go.
Thanks, Bron.